You've been praying, not casually, not out of habit, actually showing up, actually trying. And somewhere in the middle of all that effort, something shifted. The words are still the same. The routine is still the same. But the feeling is gone. And the strangest part isn't the silence itself. It's that you can't tell anyone. Because from the outside, your faith looks completely intact. That gap, that's what we're talking about today. Because this isn't the kind of doubt that makes headlines. You're not walking away. You're not angry. You still believe, somewhere underneath all of it, you do. But the warmth that used to be there, that sense of being heard, of something responding, it's just not landing the way it used to. And that absence does something to a person. It makes you question the one thing you weren't supposed to question. You start wondering if you did something wrong, if you've been praying incorrectly, if maybe you were just feeling good emotions before and calling it God. And the more you circle that thought, the worse it gets, because now you're not just experiencing silence, you're experiencing silence plus shame. And that combination is one of the loneliest places a person can sit. But here's what nobody tells you. What you're feeling has a name. It has a mechanism. And understanding it doesn't weaken your faith. It might be the first thing that actually helps. Psychologists who study human attachment, the science of how we bond with the people closest to us, found something that changed how we understand relationships entirely. A researcher named John Bowlby spent decades studying what happens to children when the person they depend on goes emotionally quiet. Not absent, not cruel, just quiet. And what he found was striking. The child doesn't think. My caregiver is having a hard time. The child's nervous system registers one thing. Something is wrong with the connection, and it reacts accordingly. Anxiety, withdrawal, a desperate attempt to restore the closeness, or eventually a kind of emotional shutdown that looks like peace but is actually protection. Now here's where this gets relevant to you. That same attachment wiring doesn't disappear when you grow up. And it doesn't stay limited to human relationships. Psychologists studying religious experience have found that the way people relate to God mirrors, almost exactly, the attachment patterns they developed in childhood. The same emotional circuitry is activated. The same responses get triggered. Which means when God feels quiet, your brain doesn't process it differently than it would any other important relationship going silent. It registers absence. It registers potential threat. And it reacts. That's not a spiritual failure. That's just how you're built. But here's the part that makes this more complicated. Your brain cannot distinguish between silence that means something is wrong and silence that means something is happening. Those two things feel identical from the inside. The same hollow feeling. The same sense of reaching and not finding. The same creeping question of whether you ever had what you thought you had. And this is where so many people get stuck. Because when the silence comes, the brain does what it always does when it encounters a threat it can't solve. It starts explaining. It builds a story. And the story it builds is almost always the worst available version. You've drifted. You've failed. God pulled back because you deserved it. You were never as close as you thought. That storytelling isn't weakness. It's your brain trying to make unpredictability feel controllable. If I can find the reason, I can fix it. That's the logic running underneath all of it. But the story isn't always true. And more often than not, the silence has nothing to do with what your brain decided it meant. And this is where it gets important. Because not all silence is the same. There's the silence that comes from exhaustion. You've been carrying a lot. Grief, pressure, overextension. And at some point, your emotional system just runs dry. The tank is empty. And when the tank is empty, feeling doesn't come. Not from prayer. Not from music. Not from anything. This isn't distance. This is depletion. Your nervous system literally cannot generate the emotional resonance it used to because it's been running on fumes for too long. Then there's the silence that comes after loss. When something you believed in, a prayer that wasn't answered the way you needed, a moment that broke something in your understanding. When something like that happens, the brain quietly restructures. It puts walls up, not to reject God, but to protect itself from hope that might not hold. And those walls muffle everything, including the things you actually want to feel. And then there's a third kind. The silence that comes when you're being moved from one kind of faith to another. A more dependent, emotionally driven faith towards something quieter and more rooted. That transition doesn't feel like growth. It feels like loss. Because something real is ending, even if what's coming next is steadier. Those three experiences feel almost identical from the inside, but they're not the same, and they don't all need the same response. Here's something that might shift something for you. The people who wrote about this most honestly weren't modern therapists. They were mystics, contemplatives, people so deeply embedded in faith that their documentation of this experience carries a different kind of weight. A 16th century monk named John of the Cross wrote an entire text about it. He called it the dark night of the soul. And what he described wasn't a crisis of belief. It was a recognized passage, a season where the emotional scaffolding of faith gets taken down, not because God is gone, but because the scaffolding was never the building. He said the consolations, the warmth, the feelings were given early to draw people in, but they were never meant to be permanent. And when they're withdrawn, the person is left with a choice. Stay because the feeling is there, or stay because something underneath the feeling is real. That's not a punishment. That's an invitation to a different kind of knowing. A 20th century mystic, Thomas Merton, wrote that the silence of God is not the silence of a person who has nothing to say. It's the silence of something deeper than words. And the people who learn to sit in that silence without running from it, without filling it, tend to come out with something that emotional highs could never produce. You're not the first person to sit where you're sitting, not even close. And this is where the text itself becomes worth looking at. Because if you read the Bible honestly, not devotionally, but honestly, what you find is a document full of people who felt exactly what you're feeling. David, who wrote more of the Psalms than anyone else, wrote this: "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" That's not a verse about a person who had lost their faith. That's a verse written by someone who believed enough to be devastated by the silence. You don't cry out to someone you've stopped believing in. Elijah, after one of the most extraordinary spiritual moments recorded in the text, collapsed under a tree and asked to die. Not because he doubted, because he was depleted. And what happened next is interesting. God didn't show up in fire or wind or earthquake. God showed up in what the text calls a still small voice, barely perceptible, easy to miss. And then there's the moment on the cross, a man who by every theological account was the most connected human to God who had ever lived, saying out loud, my God, why have you forsaken me?" If the silence has ever made you feel forsaken, you are not outside the story. You are standing inside one of its most significant moments. The silence is in the book. It was never hidden. It was always part of it. So here's where all of this lands. What if the silence isn't God pulling away? What if it's the shift from a faith that runs on feeling to a faith that runs on something that doesn't need to be felt to be real? Feelings are real. They matter. The warmth you had before wasn't fake. But feelings are also weather. They change. They respond to depletion and grief and transition and sleep and 100 other variables. Building everything on top of them is like building on the most beautiful but unpredictable ground. And your brain, which has been trying to interpret the silence as data about your standing, your worth, your closeness, your correctness, your brain has been solving the wrong problem. The silence isn't a verdict. It's a terrain. And the people who stay in it, not performing their way out of it, not white-knuckling their way back to a feeling, but actually sitting in it long enough to stop being afraid of it, those people tend to describe what they find on the other side differently than they described faith before. Less electric, more solid, less dependent on the morning going well, more present in the ordinary moments they used to rush past. You haven't been abandoned. You haven't failed. You haven't drifted beyond reach. You're just in the part of the story that didn't make it onto the highlight reel. The part that most people experience alone and in silence, and never talk about, because it doesn't come with easy language. But it has language, and it has company, and it has. If the people who walked through it before you are to be believed, a far side. You just haven't reached it yet, and that's okay. You don't have to.